The next stitch is the running stitch. Now in hand sewing, the running stitch does this as opposed to the back stitch, which is doing this. So I like to group the stitches in different, what I call concepts. The back stitch was one concept, the running stitch is another. So the easy way of sewing a running stitch, you secure your thread, of course, and then you pick up your bead and you stitch into the fabric. Then you travel underneath the fabric, pick up your bead, and continue. The idea of stitch length being either the same length as the bead or slightly longer applies here as well. Now this distance between the two stitches, between where you go in and where you emerge, that can be as tiny as 1 or 2 millimeters, or that can be several inches. But the stitch is the same. You're coming out and going back in. The drawback of this stitch, though, as opposed to a back stitch is very secure, so if you break a thread, it's going to take a while for it to unravel. The running stitch, not so much. So you have to consider what you're doing with the running stitch, what kind of use it is going to receive. But this is the running stitch. You can have single beads on a stitch, or you can have multiple beads on a stitch. Works the same way. Running stitch. We're starting a new stitch pattern. This stitch pattern is called the running stitch. You're familiar with a running stitch in hand sewing. It operates the same way here, except you're just going to be sewing on beads. I've marked out a line, and I'm going to be sewing a few running stitches with single beads to demonstrate the process. When you're sewing, I'm going to use the seed beads first. As before, stitch length is the same length of the bead or slightly longer. And the distance between where you enter and exit the fabric can be just right next to the bead, or you can space quite a ways from the bead. That is dependent on the particular design you're working with. So you can see here the stitch length onto the fabric is just a couple yards of the muslin. So I'm going to sew 3 or 4 more, and then I'm going to sew multiple beads on a running stitch so you can see that. In the background, you can hear the buzzsaw. Again, this is sewing Cinema Verite from my studio here in New York. Okay, now I'm going to sew multiple beads on a stitch with the running stitch, and that's what this is going to look like. And again, as with the back stitch, you can make the stitch length on multiple beads shorter or longer. That really depends on the texture you're wanting to create. So here's some multiple beads on a stitch. So now also you can stitch further apart. Like the scatter pattern, which I will be showing you. If you have, you can mark a scatter pattern. Now, when I'm making a randomly spaced scatter pattern, I work in groups of 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So these are uneven pentagons, really. And there's something about working in uneven pentagons that after you've filled a space, it just reads as an even spacing. I don't quite know why that works, I just know it does. So each one of these stitches then would be one bead, and you would carry the thread underneath. Now, if I'm going to be making something where you have a running stitch sewing quite a number of these beads, one thing I would try to do whenever possible is secure the thread after every so many. Generally, it's after every 5 or 6, because you have quite a lot of thread and the running stitch is not quite as strong as the back stitch. So if you break a thread, there is a greater likelihood that this stitch will come unraveled. So I'm just going to say here's 5. So as a rule, I don't like to knot off into the fabric, but in this particular case, you have a workaround. You can just come up underneath the bead and stitch down 2 or 3 times. You don't have to break your thread, but having the bead sit over where you've tied off is going to hide it, and then you can continue sewing. So here, as you can see, I'm not going to make you watch me sew this whole thing here. I'll go off camera. But as you can see, you just continue on, and you don't have to proceed in any particular way. That is entirely up to you. Having the fabric under tension will ensure that you have a proper thread tension and it won't pucker your fabric. So I'm going to go off camera, and I will come back and meet you here when this is done. And here we are. We're finished with this particular stitch, and I'm going to tie off by stitching 3 times in the same place. And trim the thread from underneath. And there you have it. Running stitch in a row, multiple beads on a stitch, and random scatter. The next 2 stitches are variations on a theme, so I'm going to put them together. The first one I call the floppy fence. The other one I call Stonehenge. They both have 3 beads on the strand, and they both are sewn with a running stitch. That is why I put them together. They're very, very similar. So, the floppy fence. After you've secured your thread, you come up and you pick up bugle bead, seed bead, and a bugle bead, and you stitch into place. Since this is a running stitch, you come here again, right next to it, bugle bead, seed bead, bugle bead. Very easy. The stitch length between these 2 should be fairly close together, and what I find is that when I'm making centers of flowers, if you start in the center and spiral out from the center and keep them closely packed, it makes very nice centers of flowers. So this is the floppy fence. The next one is going to be the Stonehenge. It is sewn with 3 bugle beads, and you sew them all on one thread. again, running stitch, come up, keep these also stitch length here. The stitch length between the two is close together. The stitch length here equals the length of the bugle bead. So these two, these stand up. This is going to be, both of these are going to be stitches that actually stand perpendicular to the fabric. So understand that. I'm drawing them flat, but when they work, they stand upright. So this here, it creates a little opening. And what I've seen that's quite nice is if you pass organza ribbon through it or something. It's quite sweet. The next two stitches that I'm going to be doing are variations on the multiple beads on a stitch for the running stitch. I'm going to make what I call the floppy fence and the Stonehenge. The floppy fence starts with a bugle bead, a seed bead, and a bugle bead. And then you stitch right down next to it so they stand perpendicular to the fabric. Then you come up next to it and you repeat bugle, seed, bugle. Now, I've been asked, okay, what would you use this for? And so I'm going to show you by going off the line here. So they stand up like so. So you can start working them around in a circle. If you start in the center and spiral out, you will get what are really attractive centers of flowers. And the beauty of this is that if you mass them together, they will stand up better because as they are close together, they hold each other up. So I'm going off the line and working in a little counterclockwise spiral here. And you can go clockwise or counterclockwise, doesn't really matter. But it's quite an effective fill, as you will see in a moment. I'm going to show you one more, then I will go off camera and finish the rest. And I will come back here. Okay, one more stitch. I'll be right back. Okay, we're finishing up on this one here. Quite pretty. The next one is the Stonehenge. So I'm going to use the other line we drew, and it's 3 bugle beads. Bugle, bugle, bugle. So the thing to know here is that the stitch length is the same length as the top bugle bead. So they will stand up like a little box. Look something like that. And since this is still a running stitch, you come up next to it, pick up 3 more, and you continue forward, again the stitch length being the same length as the top bead. And you continue there. I'll sew a couple more here. Now, people have asked me, okay, what do you use this for? And it's very pretty if you're working with a little organza ribbon that you could weave through. I like to joke that if you sew it properly, you can predict the spring and the fall equinoxes, but I understand that that's a somewhat obscure joke. So for those who don't understand, Stonehenge actually predicts the spring and fall equinoxes in the northern hemisphere. Just, a little bit of history. Okay then. I will secure the thread, and that is the Stonehenge. The next stitch, which is actually going to stand perpendicular to the fabric when it's done, is called the edging stitch. It sews in two different stages to get the entire edging stitch complete. The first is a variation of multiple beads on a running stitch. So once we secure our thread here, we're going to pick 3 seed beads and stitch into the fabric. And we're just going to continue here. I'm just going to keep these colors the same for now to eliminate confusion. So when we get to the end here, this again is going to stand perpendicular. So you want this stitch to be fairly close together so they stand up like a triangle. So now what you're looking at here is you see these gaps here, 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 and here. Now this is where I'm going to introduce you to what I call working above the surface of the fabric. So you can see here I've drawn a line about 1 inch long, and I'm going to be sewing seed beads, and this is another one of those multiple beads on a stitch variations. So I will put on 3 seed beads, and stitch them down so they stand in a little triangle. You can kind of see they sit up like that. And then again, since it's a running stitch, you come out here and continue on. I'll sew one more, and then I'll go off camera and finish this row. But it's fairly straightforward. Running stitch, 3 beads on the stitch. These beads are the seed beads. And I will finish and come back here. Okay, I'm finishing up this row. Now, you could keep this as its own detail. This would make a really lovely edge on an applique. It would not be quite as secure as a back stitch, but it would hide stitches if you're going to be stitching an applique to a ground fabric. But in order to work through the holes of the beads, you can see we have gaps here on all of these. First, I need to turn the work over and secure the thread from the back. To begin, what you're going to do, you're going to turn the work over, and I will show you this. And you're going to slide the needle under this stitch here, just to catch it. Here I have the fabric turned over. Now you can see the difference in show through. I'll zoom this in a little bit. You can see the difference in show through from the back stitches to the running stitches. And here, this is the one we're working on. Now, the thing to know here is that if you're sewing on a transparent or semi-sheer fabric, you try to avoid something with a lot of thread on the back just because it will show. Whenever possible, you want to sew so that the thread is all up in the beads on the top of the fabric rather than on the back. So running stitches are a little better that way. But zooming in on this one here, this is the end of our row. And so what I want to do before I bring the thread back out is I want to just catch the needle under that stitch. Because catching the needle under this stitch will then enable me to put the needle back through and bring it back to the right side of the fabric. I'll turn the fabric back over and you'll get to see where we're at. Then you're going to bring the needle back through these two beads here. So at this point, the needle is above the fabric, as they say. Now I'm going to use cut beads as the spacers between here so that you can see what we're doing. So you'll string on one cut bead, then pass the needle through this seed bead, another cut bead, and you just keep working through. And then the last, when you're at the last seed bead, and well, the two seed beads here, you're going to pass the needle through this bead and then through this bead down into the fabric, and there you have it. So we have what looks like two rows of beads standing, and the cut beads will add a little bit of sparkle. Here we are, back on the front side of the fabric. Now you can see when I put the needle back through the fabric, it came up through the end bead here, which is what you want. Then I'm going to put the needle through this top bead here. And so now this is, as they say, above the fabric. So everything until we get to the other end is going to work just through the holes of the beads. I'm going to use a cut bead so you can see the difference. So here, thread on a cut bead, and then just go through the top bead and you're just going to continue all the way across. You string on a cut bead, you pick up the top seed bead, now you could use seed beads, but I like the cut beads because they offer a little more sparkle, and also you get to see what you've done. Otherwise, if you use all seed beads, it just looks like a row of seed beads. It's not quite so spectacular. So I will go off camera because it's 10 o'clock and come back when I'm at the end. Okay, I've strung the last of the cut beads on, and so what I need to do now is go through the top bead here and then go down through the end bead like so. I'll secure my thread from the back, and this here is what I call the edging stitch. This next stitch is the boucle, and I want to show you this little sample first. This here is a vintage handbag from probably the 1920s that was never made up. What you can see here in it is that these loops are, you have like 22 beads on this, I've counted, and it creates a nice sparkle, and they're laid in like shingles. But the idea that you have a large number of beads on a strand is called the boucle stitch. And so we're going to demonstrate that next. I'll show you some examples of boucle stitch, the different spacings, the different heights and such, but really it's a simple stitch and it's a running stitch. So we're looking at the cross section of the fabric. And a boucle stitch, really, depending on how many stitches or beads you put on the stitch, you're going to thread whatever number of beads on that stitch you want. And this is, again, where you would be sampling and making, you make your sample and experiment before you actually commit to the project. Then this will stitch down into the fabric. Now, something to know here is don't pull the tension too tightly. If you pull the tension too tightly, it's going to actually sit up from the fabric and it won't look quite so nice. Another thing to know is the more beads you have on the strand, the more it will drape and move. So these are things, again, you would experiment with. And the distance between the stitches here, that again is up to you. The boucle stitch is really the number of stitches on one thread. And there's a little handbag I'm going to show you, and the handbag has rows of boucle stitch, and what they've done is they've worked it. Here we are. They've worked the rows, and they had one row, they come back. So they go on kind of like shingles. There are 22 beads on that strand in that particular sample. The next row up would be a similar thing, and they'll overlap the row below them, and they overlap each other. So this, again, you would experiment with your sample. One thing to do is look at garments that are beaded and see what they've done. And when you see this, you can see the different kinds of spacing that are needed. So you can space this random spaced like you spaced your seed beads here, or you could space it in rows. So I'm going to work 2 or 3 rows like the little sample handbag. So what that does, the rows, they drew the rows, and then they started on the bottom row and worked up. It's much easier than trying to start from the top and work down. If you've ever shingled a house, you'll know. So there are, like I said, 21 beads on these strands. So this, I'm going to just string a couple, and then I'm going to work ahead, and you'll get to see the total effect. This is tedious. This is one of those things that they did for fun. So here, 3, 6, 9, 12, 16, 4 more. Okay. So they made a stitch. Now when you're sewing boucle, the object here is you want them to drape, so you don't want too tight a tension. And so for this, they came back. And strung more. Let's see. It's tedious, I know. You can do your nails while I'm stringing these. Okay. And so again, that comes over like so. And what I would do with this is I would secure after every third stitch. That way you don't run afoul of, if you break a thread, an entire row comes unraveled. So that is where I'm going to leave you. I will go off camera and I will stitch some more, and I will be back. As you can see here, I worked ahead and I've drawn an extra row between these two lines here. I'm going to sew the last boucle in place, but I want to show you a little trick. This is something I learned years ago. If you have your beads in a container like this, you just stab and that will be a way of quickly getting the number of beads that you need onto your needle. This one, like the other running stitches, I like to secure after every 3 or 4. And really, again, how you do it, instead of turning it over and stitching through the stitches, is you just come in and sew 3 or 4 times in place underneath the bead. And especially with this texture, that will anchor everything quite securely, and you really won't see it in the final product. And so now we have boucle stitch. This stitch is called the vermicelli stitch. This stitch is also still a running stitch, and the object of this stitch is to create a fill. And so the fill, it's called stippling in quilting. Creating a fill with wavy lines that kind of go in and on themselves. See, this is the object. If you notice, if you separated this out, if you had a large enough piece of it, it would just turn into texture. That is the object here. But the vermicelli, the stitch is fairly easy. Whether you're using a number of seed beads or whether you're using bugle beads, which I'm going to demonstrate with, it's fairly simple. You start, we're looking down on the fabric now. You thread on a bugle bead and you stitch in, and then you bring the needle back out. It comes out, and you stitch I know it's a bit painstaking, but here we have it. I hope you all are enjoying my flashy computer graphics here. So the object here is you're creating that squiggly fill, and each little stitch here is a running stitch. Now the drawback with this is that it's not terribly durable. You would be using this on evening clothes, anything that you're not going to be digging a ditch with, because it is rather fragile. What I like to do after, say, every 5 or 6 beads, I will stitch 2 or 3 times in the same place under one of the beads to secure it, because the drawback here is if you break a thread, since this is a running stitch, if you don't secure it every so often, you can lose an entire section of the vermicelli stitch. So yes, vermicelli stitch. This next stitch, as you've seen diagrammed out, is the vermicelli stitch, and the object of it is to create an overall fill, but it is the running stitch. I'm not going to fill a giant area of this, but I'm going to show you how to do it so that you know. This is a running stitch, and you can make this with single bugle beads or multiples of seed beads. The object here, of course, is to keep somewhat of a curvilinear line that will then eventually read as a fill. But it takes some doing. It is a bit more work than other stitches. Now, Bob Mackie in the 80s used to use this a lot in his work. And there is a story of the San Francisco Opera that did a version of an opera called Lulu, and he designed all the costumes. One of the dresses was covered with vermicelli stitch, and it had to go through a lot of stress in the particular action of the act, and the costume mistress told me that after every performance they would go out on the stage and vacuum up beads. Now, if you've spilled beads, this is just something to know because you will do it. We all do it. If you spill beads, what you will do is get a nylon stocking and put the nylon stocking over the nozzle on your vacuum cleaner and then go vacuuming. So what will happen is that the beads will stick to the nylon stocking. You hold the nozzle over a bowl and turn the vacuum cleaner off, and the beads will then drop into the bowl. That's just a little tidbit I learned from her, because yes, we will all spill beads. It is just what you do. So as you can see, like I diagrammed out, you just keep curving around in a curvilinear fashion, and you have little tiny stitches so it doesn't show through a lot from the back. I will go off camera and fill in some more so you can see it. Here I have a little more sewn out here. I'm going to bring in this sample here. This is vermicelli with sequins. Let me move that over here. It's all sewn with a running stitch. But if you look carefully, I'll zoom in a little bit here. If you look carefully, this is all sewn as a vermicelli pattern. And as it fills in the ground, it actually just turns into texture. The beauty of this particular idea, vermicelli, is that it creates the illusion of more beads on a garment than there actually are. You know, if you really look closely, you can see the space between the beads, but if you zoom it out, it just looks like sparkly fabric, and you really, really get the illusion that there's a lot more there than there is. So, vermicelli, whether it be with sequins or whether it be with bugle beads or seed beads. There you have it. Couching, in my mind, is not technically a running stitch, but I put it in with the running stitch category because I don't know where else to put it. When you sew beads on a line, there are different ways of doing it. There is, if you want to sew, say, an edge of an applique, if you want to sew the applique, you would sew it with a back stitch because it's a lot more secure. If you want to get the beads sewn down in a hurry, and this is something that is considered completely correct, even though I regard it a little bit search and destroy, I've done it myself, is called couching. So with couching, what you're going to do is you're going to have a string of beads, a number of beads strung on a thread, and they come strung. Strung beads are called schlung, just so you know. So the object, if you're wanting to make a straight line of beads and get it done quickly, is couching. So the line here is the line we've drawn on the fabric. Here is the string of beads that we're going to be using. And really, you come out from the fabric and you're just coming up and over. The stitch is going to fall between the beads, and the stitch actually is somewhat horizontal. You're coming out of the fabric, going over, going back in. So what you're creating is a little loop that comes and it just holds those beads together. Now, the thing about this that makes it much more efficient when you have to get something done in a hurry is that you don't have to go between every bead. The general rule here is the straighter the line, the fewer times you have to tack it down between the beads, say 5 or 6 or 8. If it's a sharper curve, then you might have to go between every other bead just to manage the curve. But the object here is to get this done in a hurry. So this is called the couching stitch. Now we're going to sew couching. With the couching stitch, really what it involves is sewing a line of strung beads onto your drawn line. So what I will do first, bring this out here, and then I'm going to thread off a number of these beads onto the working thread. Now, you could use these strung individually and just pull the ends of this particular string underneath. And for a long, long strand, I would recommend that. But for a short strand, you can approach it this way. You could use this on any kind of bead. I just brought these out because they're different, something pretty to look at. I had a lot of them. Okay, so we're going to put the needle in the thread. Give yourself a tiny bit extra. Don't put it right at the end because you want a little bit of slack. The thread is going to pass over between the beads and you don't want to lose that extra. So now, depending on how curved or straight this line is, you can do this every 6th bead. I'm just going to do it every 2nd bead here just because we're demonstrating. So you're going to bring the needle out right on the line, as you can see, and then we're going to bring the thread over and go back in the same hole. So as you can see, the thread will drop down between the beads. Now you don't want to pull this too tight because if you pull it too tight, you're going to make the string of beads buckle. You want it secured enough to hold it down, but not so tight that it's going to make the string buckle. And so that extra slack that you've added at the end will distribute itself because the thread will take up a little bit of space between the beads. So the stitch actually functions like that. And one more. When you're using this is what I call the quick and dirty method of sewing beads in a line. It is considered completely correct. It is not as secure as other methods, so you really want to make sure that you use strong thread with all of this, because then you'll know that it is safe. Couching. Sequins on a running stitch is different than sequins on a back stitch. Whereas with the sequins on a back stitch, you're going to see the thread, or you're going to add beads to the stitch, so you'll have a line of either thread or beads down the row of sequins. With sequins on a running stitch, you're going to create the illusion that the sequins are overlapping like coins, a stack of coins. So you will have a minimal show through on the thread. So to begin, we're going to start here. We're looking at the surface of the fabric. We're looking at the line that you've drawn on the fabric. So we're going to come up here, and we're going to thread on the first sequin. And so here, there's the hole. The sequin is laying flat on the fabric. So you're going to put the needle in right where the edge of the sequin meets the line. And you're going to be just, and the width of the stitches are actually going to be horizontal. The width of the stitch is actually the width of the line. So that sews the first stitch down, and it sews the first sequin down. Now, to continue, you're going to bring the thread out just on the other side of this little narrow line where the edge of the sequin meets the line. You will then lay sequin number 2 down over sequin number 1. And so then again, you're going to be consistent. You're going to put the needle right in to one side of where the edge of the sequin meets the line. And for the next sequin, you're going to emerge opposite. There. That's where you're going to come out. This is going to come out like so. You're going to thread on sequin number 3. I know this is a bit tedious, but my computer graphics system is under development. So always in on the same side of the line, say on the left side of the line, and you come out on the right side of the line. So if you flipped it over from the back, you would just see little tiny horizontal stitches. And if the sequins are actually of good quality, you get a minimal show through where the edge of the sequin meets the hole of the previous sequin. So it creates the look of coins stacked down. No thread showing. Sequins on a running stitch. For sequins on a running stitch, we draw the line onto the fabric, and the width of the line is actually going to be the dimension of the stitch. Let me zoom in a little bit here. So to begin, you thread on the first sequin. It sits down against the fabric, and so what you're doing here is you're putting the needle in just to one side of the line that you drew. And that stitches down. Then you bring the needle up down a little more so you can see it. Yeah, you can see the needle comes up on the other side of the line. Then we thread on sequin number 2, and sequin number 2 will overlap sequin number 1. And again, you're consistent. You put the needle in just to the left side of the line, close the stitch, and you bring the needle out just to the right side of the line. And I'll stitch a couple more so you can see. There we go. Now I'm going to adjust the camera down a little bit so you can get a better look at that. I just think it's really important to see this. Here we are back again. So you can see just to one side, down, and just to the other side, back. And I'll stitch 2 or 3 more so you can see, and then I'll show you some examples of where you use this. So here we are. I'm going to slide this one down. And you see we go in just to that side, right where the edge of the sequin meets the line. And we come up opposite. And we just keep repeating that. Now, by definition, the stitch length is the length between the whole of the sequin and the edge. And in a moment, I'm going to show you a sample of how you can vary that to create more dimension. This is a sweater that someone gave me some years ago. And see these flowers here. You see how the sequins sort of lift up. They don't lay flat, but they create a nice dimensional effect. It is this exact same stitch, but the difference is that when you're stitching it out, you will lay the sequin down and you'll slide the sequin slightly back and make the stitch shorter so it's not going to land right there. It's going to go backwards slightly. And the further back the stitch sews, the further it inclines. I'll sew 2 or 3 there. You can see it's already wanting to stand up. See? And so here, push that stitch back slightly. And the further back you push it, the more it sits on its edge. So those are 2 ways that you can sew sequins on a running stitch. As you can see here, you don't really see a lot of show through on the thread, quite unlike sewing it on with a back stitch. But here, you can get the sequins to somewhat stand on edge. And I'll show you a side view of that in a moment. So here you have the side view. Sequins on a running stitch.